The gate was already open when Daniel Hargrove's car turned into the long driveway. That was the first thing that felt wrong. The iron gate at Hargrove Mansion had been kept closed every evening since Daniel was 8 years old. His mother, Margaret Hargrove, had a rule about it. She had a rule about everything. But the gate was open, and the lights inside the house were on in rooms that were never lit after 7 in the evening. And Daniel sat behind the wheel for 3 full seconds before he pressed the accelerator again and drove the rest of the way up to the house. He had been gone for 8 months. He told himself it was work. The assignment in Edinburgh had been real. The meetings had been real. The pressure from the company had been real. But Daniel was also a man who knew how to stay somewhere when coming home felt difficult, and coming home to the mansion had always felt difficult. His mother occupied every room of it, even the ones she was not in. His wife, Amara, had arrived into that house 18 months ago as a bride, and in the months before Daniel left, he had watched her navigate Margaret's silences and corrections and unspoken measurements with a kind of quiet patience that made him feel both grateful and guilty. Grateful because Amara never complained. Guilty because he knew she should have. He had told himself he would be back in 6 weeks. 6 weeks became 3 months. 3 months became 5. And then one morning he woke up in his rented flat in Edinburgh and looked at the ceiling and thought, I have let this go on too long, and booked a flight home for the following Thursday. That was today. He pulled up to the front steps and cut the engine. He expected the door to be opened by one of the household staff. He expected to walk into the formal entrance hall with its cold marble floor and its portrait of his late father above the fireplace, and its smell of old furniture and discipline. He expected his mother to appear at the top of the staircase and look down at him the way she always had, as though she were assessing whether he had improved during his absence. The front door opened before he could reach the top step. Not by a member of staff. Amara stood in the doorway. She was 7 months pregnant, and Daniel had known this from their phone calls and from the photographs she sent, but seeing her in person was an entirely different experience. She was fuller, softer in her face, and she was wearing a loose cream-colored dress that caught the light from inside the house, and she was barefoot on the threshold of the mansion in a way that the old Amara, the careful new bride Amara, would never have been. She looked at him for a moment without speaking. You actually came, she said. It was not cruel. It was not a performance. It was simply an honest sentence from a woman who had not been entirely certain, and Daniel felt it land somewhere in his chest with more weight than he expected. I came, he said. She stepped back to let him in. The entrance hall stopped him before he had taken 3 steps inside. The portrait of his father was still there. The marble floor was the same, but the long side table that had always held a single arrangement of white lilies, stiff and formal and replaced every Tuesday, now held something else entirely. There were soft yellow flowers in a clay pot, the kind that looked like someone had picked them from a garden rather than ordered them from a florist. Beside the pot was a small framed photograph. Daniel stepped closer. It was a photograph of Amara and his mother. They were both covered in paint. A pale yellow paint, the kind you would use on a nursery wall. They were standing in a room Daniel could not immediately identify, and they were laughing. His mother's head was thrown back. He had not seen his mother laugh like that since before his father died, and even then he was not entirely sure he had seen it. He picked up the photograph. When was this? He asked. 4 months ago, Amara said from behind him. We painted the nursery ourselves. Your mother insisted on doing the high parts of the wall, even though I told her to let the painter handle it. She got more paint on herself than on the wall. Daniel set the photograph down carefully. He turned to ask where his mother was, and before he could form the words, he heard her voice. It was coming from the direction of the sitting room down the east corridor, the formal sitting room that had always been reserved for guests and occasions. It was the room where, as a boy, Daniel had been taken to receive correction. He had never heard laughter come from it before in his life. He heard laughter now. His mother's voice, and then a softer voice he didn't recognize, and then his mother again, warm and easy, the way a person sounds when they are entirely comfortable in a moment. He looked at Amara. She looked back at him with an expression that was not quite a smile, not quite something else. It was the expression of a person who has lived through something large and is waiting to find out whether the person in front of them is ready to understand it. She has a friend from the hospital prenatal group, Amara said. They've been meeting twice a week. Her name is Carol. She's 64 and terrible at cards, which your mother finds very entertaining. Daniel did not know what to say to that. He picked up his bag from where he'd set it by the door and stood in the hallway of the house he had grown up in, and he understood with the slow certainty of a man who has been away too long that something fundamental had shifted in his absence, and that he was going to need time to understand what it was. Amara touched his arm. Just briefly. I'll show you to our room, she said. I moved some of your things around to make space. I hope that's all right. Of course, he said. He followed her up the wide staircase, past the portraits and the closed doors, and the familiar smell of the house, and he noticed that there were small things different everywhere he looked. A soft rug on the landing that had not been there before. A row of small potted plants along the windowsill at the top of the stairs. A coat hook near the nursery door, with a small pair of booties already hanging on it, impossibly tiny, pale green. He stopped at the nursery door. It was open, just slightly. He pushed it gently and looked inside. The room had been his mother's private space for as long as he could remember. He had been told as a child never to go inside. He had assumed it was used for storage, or perhaps for nothing at all. A room kept closed out of habit. He had never questioned it because Margaret Hargrove was not a woman you questioned about closed doors. The room was now a nursery. Soft yellow walls, a white wooden crib near the window, a low armchair in the corner with a pale quilt folded over its arm, a small shelf of books, a mobile above the crib made of paper birds in different shades of blue and green. It was warm. It was ready. It was the kind of room that had been made by people who cared about the person who would live in it. She helped me choose everything in here, Amara said quietly from behind him. The crib, the mobile, the paint color. She had opinions about all of it. I let her have them. Daniel stepped back from the door. He followed Amara to their bedroom and set his bag down and sat on the edge of the bed. The room smelled faintly of the lotion Amara used. He noticed she had put a photograph of the two of them on the bedside table, one from their wedding, which he did not remember being there before he left. Are you hungry? Amara asked. Yes, he said. And then, because he needed to say something true, he said, I'm sorry I stayed away so long. Amara looked at him. I know, she said. Not you should be. Not it hurt me. Not I needed you. Just I know, which was somehow the fullest possible response. She went downstairs to see about dinner, and Daniel sat in the room for a while longer, listening to the house around him. Down the corridor, he could hear his mother's laughter again. In the walls of the place he thought he knew entirely, he heard something he had not heard in this building in 30 years. It sounded like a home. He did not know yet what his place in it was. He would spend the next several days finding out, and what he found would not be what he expected, and it would not be easy, and it would not let him off the hook for a single thing he had chosen. But sitting there on the edge of the bed with the small sounds of the house around him, Daniel Hargrove understood one thing with complete clarity. He had come back to restore something, but the something he'd come back to restore had already been built without him, by the two women he had underestimated most, and it was better than anything he himself had ever managed to build inside these walls. That was not comfortable. It was also, underneath all the discomfort, the most hopeful thing he had felt in 8 months. He got up. He washed his face. He went downstairs to join his family. Daniel woke up the next morning before anyone else in the house. This surprised him, because he had slept poorly, turning through the night with the particular restlessness of a man whose mind will not leave him alone. He had expected to find the house already moving when he came downstairs, the staff setting the breakfast table, his mother already seated and reading the paper the way she had done every morning of his childhood. Instead, the kitchen was dim and quiet, and the only light came from the window above the sink where the early sun was starting to come through. He found the coffee and made a pot. He stood at the kitchen counter and drank it, and looked around the room. He had not spent much time in the kitchen growing up. Margaret had considered the kitchen a staff domain, and family members had not been encouraged to wander through it. But someone had changed the kitchen in ways that were subtle and total at the same time. There was a bowl of fruit on the counter that looked like it was restocked regularly, fresh and varied. There were herbs growing in small pots along the window ledge, basil and rosemary, and something he didn't recognize with small purple flowers. On the refrigerator, held by a plain magnet, was a handwritten list of things that needed to be bought, and the handwriting switched halfway down the list from Amara's careful rounded script to his mother's angular print, as if they had stood there together adding items. He read the list twice. He was still looking at it when Amara came in, moving carefully the way women in late pregnancy do, one hand resting on the side of her stomach. She was wearing a robe and her hair was loose, and she looked surprised to see him. "You're up," she said. "Couldn't sleep." "There's more coffee," he said, though it came out in the wrong order, as an offer rather than a question. He corrected himself. "Do you want coffee? Can you have coffee?" "Half a cup," she said. "I've been having half a cup in the mornings. Your mother researched it extensively and confirmed it was acceptable." He poured her a half cup. She sat down at the kitchen table, which she did with the ease of a person who had sat there many mornings. This, too, was new. The formal breakfast room was down the hall. The kitchen table had always been for staff. He sat across from her. For a moment neither of them said anything, but it was not an unfriendly silence. It was the silence of two people who need to say several large things and are deciding which one to start with. "Tell me what happened," Daniel said. "From the beginning. I want to understand." Amara looked at her coffee cup. She turned it slowly in her hands. "From which beginning?" "From when you found out about the baby." She was quiet for a moment. Then she began to talk, and she talked for a long time, and Daniel listened. She had discovered the pregnancy at 9 weeks. She had not told Daniel immediately because she had wanted to be certain, and also because she was still processing it herself. And she had been alone with it for 4 days before Margaret found the test in the bathroom. She had not planned for Margaret to find out that way. She had been in the bedroom when she heard the knock at the bathroom door, and when she opened it, Margaret was standing there holding the test with an unreadable expression, and Amara's first thought was that she was in trouble, the way a young woman in a difficult house always expects to be in trouble. Margaret had looked at her for a long moment. Then she had said, "When did you know?" 4 days ago, Amara had told her. Margaret had nodded once, very slowly, and handed the test back to her, and walked away down the corridor. That was it. That was the whole exchange. And Amara had stood there, not knowing what to make of it. For 3 weeks after that, nothing changed. Margaret was not warmer. She was not colder. She was exactly as she had always been, precise and formal and somewhat distant, and Amara began to wonder if the woman had simply filed the information away and intended to act as though it had not happened. Then came the night at 12 weeks when the nausea was so bad that Amara could not get off the bathroom floor. She had not called anyone. She had not wanted to disturb the staff, and she had not wanted to seem weak in front of Margaret. And Daniel was 6 hours ahead in Edinburgh, and it was the middle of the night, and she was telling herself it would pass. She sat on the bathroom floor with her back against the cold wall, and breathed carefully, and waited for it to ease. The door opened. Margaret was standing there in her dressing gown, her hair down for the first time Amara had ever seen, which made her look different, and somehow older, and more human. She looked at Amara on the floor. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she went to the linen shelf, took a small towel, dampened it at the sink, and came and sat down on the bathroom floor beside Amara. She handed her the towel. She did not say you should have called someone. She did not say let me get the doctor. She sat on the floor, which must have been uncomfortable for a woman of 62, with the posture of a general, and she stayed. They sat there for over an hour. Margaret did not speak much, but at some point she had said quietly, almost to herself, "The first months are the hardest, and the loneliest." Amara had not asked her what she meant. She had learned later, slowly and in pieces, what Margaret had never told anyone. In the second year of her marriage, Margaret had lost a pregnancy at 5 months, a boy. She had gone through it largely alone, because Daniel's father, Edward Hargrove, had been the kind of man who dealt with difficult things by not being in the room where they were happening. She had never spoken of it afterward. She had locked a room in the house, and she had locked a door in herself, and she had kept both of them closed for 40 years. When Amara told Daniel this part of the story, Sitting at the kitchen table in the early morning light, he went very still. He had not known. He was 41 years old and he had not known this about his own mother. He tried to remember whether there had been any signs of it and he could not. He thought about the locked room that had become the nursery, and he understood now what it had held, and why his mother had been the one to suggest painting it. He did not speak for a moment after Amara finished that part. "She told you all of this?" he said. "Not all at once," Amara said. "Over months. She is not a person who speaks about herself easily, but once she began, she did not stop. I think she had been carrying it for a very long time and it was heavy." He thought about his mother at 62, sitting on a bathroom floor in the middle of the night to be company to the young woman his son had left alone in her house. He thought about 40 years of a locked room. "What changed between you after that?" he asked. Amara considered. "She started asking me things," she said. "Not about the pregnancy at first. About me, where I had grown up, what my mother was like, what I had studied, things she had never asked before. I think in the beginning she was filling the silence because she did not know what else to do. But then I think she became genuinely curious, and I was curious about her. We had been living in the same house for a year and a half and we had never talked to each other properly. So they had begun to talk. Slowly. The way you learn to trust a thing that you were afraid of." Margaret had walked with Amara in the estate garden in the evenings. She had accompanied her to some of the hospital appointments, sitting in the waiting room with a book, never presuming to come into the examination, just being there when Amara came out. She had learned what foods Amara could and couldn't manage in the mornings and had instructed the kitchen accordingly, without telling Amara she had done it, so that one morning there was ginger tea and plain toast, and no smell of eggs anywhere, and Amara had stood in the kitchen doorway and understood silently that she had been considered. Daniel listened to all of it. He listened to the story of the sitting room being rearranged so Amara would have somewhere comfortable to rest in the afternoons. He listened to the story of his mother learning to use a telephone application so she could send Amara photographs of baby items she had seen in shops and ask her opinion. He listened to the story of the two of them spending an entire Saturday choosing the mobile above the nursery crib, Margaret insisting on the one with the hand-painted birds because the cheaper one looked, in her words, like it had given up. He listened to all of it, and he felt, beneath the warmth of it, and the relief of it, and the genuine surprise of it, a quiet and persistent ache. He had been somewhere else when all of this happened. He had chosen to be somewhere else. And two women who had barely spoken properly in a year and a half had built something real in the house he had left behind. And the baby who was coming in 8 weeks would arrive into a family that had already learned how to be one, in the months when he was in Edinburgh avoiding the difficulty of coming home. He did not say any of that out loud, but Amara looked at him across the kitchen table, in the early morning light with her coffee and her loose hair, and her 7-month large belly, and she said, quietly and without cruelty, she needed someone to need her. I needed someone who knew the house. We found each other. He nodded. He could not trust his voice fully at that moment. "And me?" he managed. Amara looked at him steadily. "You needed to come home," she said. "So I'm glad you did." She got up carefully from the table and went to refill her cup. From somewhere above them, they heard the sound of Margaret's door opening, her footsteps on the landing, the particular way she walked that Daniel had known his entire life. Measured, unhurried, but lighter now, he thought, than it used to be. He sat at the kitchen table in the house he had grown up in the house he had left, in the house that had kept on breathing without him. He had a great deal of work to do. He was only beginning to understand what kind. He had expected an argument at some point. That was what Daniel kept waiting for. In the days after his return, as he moved through the mansion trying to find his place in the life that had organized itself without him, he had expected his mother to say something sharp about the months he had been away. He had expected Amara to let her patience slip once, to let him see how much the absence had cost her. He had been braced for it, carrying that brace in his shoulders the way a man carries a thing he knows is coming but doesn't know exactly when. Neither of them gave him the argument. Instead, what they gave him was something more difficult, which was their daily lives, simply continuing, with him now present in them, like a new piece of furniture that the room had not been arranged around and needed to be accommodated without disrupting everything else. He noticed this most clearly on the 4th day, When he came downstairs and found his mother and Amara already at the kitchen table together, going through a list of things that needed to be prepared before the baby arrived. They were not fighting over the list. They were not being polite to each other in the way of women who dislike each other but are performing tolerance. They were working through it efficiently, each contributing, Margaret crossing items off with a pen, and Amara adding things that Margaret had not thought of, and Margaret considering those additions, and either agreeing or proposing alternatives, and the whole thing moving with the ease of a partnership that had been practiced. Daniel poured himself coffee and sat down, and they included him immediately, asking his opinion on a question about the spare room and whether it should be used for overnight guests after the birth or kept available for other purposes. He gave his opinion. They considered it. They moved on. He was included, but he was not necessary in the way he would have been if he had been there all along. He thought about that for the rest of the morning. On the fifth day, he decided to do something that felt small, but was not small. He sought out his mother alone. He found her in the garden, which she visited every morning and had since he was a child, walking the paths between the rose beds with the slow deliberateness of a woman who is also doing something in her mind while she is doing something with her feet. He fell into step beside her. She did not seem surprised. They walked for a little while without speaking. The garden in early autumn still had color in it, and the air was cool and clean. Daniel's mother walked the way she had always walked, upright and precise. But there was, as Amara had suggested, something in her body that was less armored than it used to be, as though some interior scaffolding had been removed, and what was underneath it was still standing perfectly well. "I didn't know," Daniel said, "about what you lost, before I was born." Margaret kept walking. She did not break her pace. She was quiet for a moment, in the particular way she had always been quiet when she was deciding how much to say. "No," she said. "You didn't. I should have." She considered this. "Perhaps. But I did not want to be known that way. I spent a great deal of my life not wanting to be known that way." "What changed?" She was quiet again. They reached the end of the rosebed path and she turned, and they began walking the other direction. "Amara was ill one night," she said. "The early months. She was alone, and she did not ask for help because she did not want to impose, which I recognized as something I had taught her without intending to, by the way I ran this house. And I found her, and I sat with her, and I remembered sitting by myself in a room in the opposite wing of this house, in the third month of a pregnancy I would lose 2 months later, and thinking that I would give nearly anything to have someone simply come and sit on the floor with me." She paused. She looked at the roses. "I had spent 40 years making sure no one would need to sit on the floor for me, and then I sat on the floor for her, and it was the least alone I had felt in a very long time." She resumed walking. "I expect that sounds strange." "It doesn't," Daniel said. He meant it. "I was not easy with her, at the beginning," Margaret said. It was the kind of statement she made as a fact, not an apology, though it contained something that functioned like regret. "I had standards for this house that were not about the house. They were about control. When you have lost something you had no control over, you find other things to be very particular about." Daniel thought about his own tendency to work long hours. He thought about Edinburgh. "I understand that," he said quietly. His mother glanced at him sideways. "I expect you do," she said, and left it there. They walked the rest of the path in silence. At the end of it, just before they turned to go back toward the house, Margaret stopped and looked out across the garden for a moment. "She is a good person, Daniel," she said. "Amara. Not good in the way of someone who is simply agreeable. Good in the way of someone who is honest and patient and willing to extend generosity when none has been given to them first. I did not make it easy for her to be here, and she stayed, and she did not become hard because of it." She paused. "That is a quality that is worth more than I understood when you brought her here." "I know," Daniel said. "Do you?" she said. Not unkindly, as a genuine question. He thought about it honestly. "I'm learning to." She nodded. It was the nod of a woman who finds that an acceptable answer. They went inside. That evening, he found himself in the kitchen after dinner, standing at the sink doing the washing up. He had not been asked to do this. The household staff usually handled the kitchen after meals. But the staff had gone for the evening and Amara had gone up to rest and his mother was in the sitting room with her book. And Daniel had simply stayed in the kitchen and started washing the dishes. He didn't think about it as a significant act. He just did it because it needed doing and he was there. His mother appeared in the kitchen doorway a few minutes later. She looked at him at the sink for a moment with an expression he couldn't fully read. Then she picked up a dish towel and stood beside him and began to dry. They worked in silence for a while. The kitchen was warm. Outside the window, the estate was dark and quiet, and the stars were beginning to come out. "I called back the next morning," Daniel said. His mother looked at him. "When Amara had the scare, the bleeding, in the 5th month, he kept his hands in the sink. She told me about it. She said she called. I called back the next morning." Margaret dried a glass slowly. "Yes," she said. "I don't have an excuse for that," he said. "No," she said, "you don't." She set the glass down. She picked up another one. She did not say anything else about it, and neither did he, because there was nothing else to say about it, and the silence that followed was not comfortable, but it was honest, which was its own kind of progress. Later, lying awake in the bedroom while Amara slept beside him, Daniel stared at the ceiling and thought about the man he had been when he left this house, and the man he needed to be now that he was back in it. The gap between those two men was not a gap in achievement or ability. It was a gap in attention. He had been present in his work, present in his obligations, present in the careful management of his outward responsibilities. He had not been present in the way that mattered. He had married a woman and installed her in a difficult house, and told himself that because he had provided the house, he had done enough. He had stood on the side of conflicts and told himself that because he never made things worse, he was not responsible for the fact that they were not better. He had stayed in Edinburgh because going home required him to be in a room with the things he had avoided, and he was better at avoiding than at being in the room. He was in the room now. And what he found in it was not disaster, because the people in this house were stronger than he had credited them for. But the fact that it was not disaster did not mean that he had not failed. It meant that other people had compensated for his failure, and that was not something a man should be comfortable with. He turned on his side. Amara was sleeping on her left side the way she always had, one hand resting on her stomach even in sleep, the slight weight of the pregnancy visible even in the shape of her shoulders. He watched her breathe in the dark room. He thought about what she had said to him at the hospital appointment she had let him come to that afternoon, where the doctor had gone through the final preparations and asked if they had any questions, and Amara had taken a small notepad from her bag with a list of things written on it. A list she had clearly prepared, careful and thorough and completely her own. He had sat beside her and contributed one question, because everything else on the list had already been thought of. She had not pointed this out. On the way home, she had simply put her hand over his on the center console of the car, and left it there, and looked out the window, and that had been the most significant moment of his week. He made a decision in the dark bedroom, not in words but in the way decisions are actually made, which is in the body, in the shift of resolve that feels like something settling. He was going to stop waiting to be needed. He was going to start doing the things that needed doing, and being the person who did them, without being asked, without being thanked, without it being a performance of effort. He was going to learn the shape of this household as it was now, not as it had been before, and he was going to fit himself to it, rather than expecting it to rearrange itself around him. He had come home expecting to take up the space he had left. It turned out the space he had left had been filled, productively and lovingly, and without him. So he would make new space, a different shape, something that actually fit. He closed his eyes. For the first time since his return, he slept without turning. There is a particular kind of morning that arrives in the 8th month of a pregnancy, when everything in the house begins to feel like preparation. Daniel started to recognize it in the 2nd week after his return. It was in the way Amara moved through the rooms, taking stock of things, touching the edge of the nursery doorframe as she passed it, pausing at the window that looked out over the garden, as if she were memorizing the view. It was in the way his mother appeared at breakfast each morning with a quiet readiness about her, like a person who has done everything they can do, and is now simply staying present until they are needed. Daniel tried to find his version of that readiness. he was not always graceful about it. On the first Monday of his second week home, he decided to take over the management of the household accounts, which he had previously left entirely to his mother and the estate manager. He sat down with the ledgers and the files and worked through them carefully, and found that in the past 8 months, 3 changes had been made that he had not been consulted on and had not known about. The East Wing heating system had been replaced, a fund had been set up for the nursery, and a weekly grocery account had been opened at a different shop to one his mother had used for 30 years, closer to town, and with a better selection of things Amara needed. He noted all 3 of these things. He did not reverse any of them. He did not comment on any of them. He simply continued going through the accounts and brought himself up to the current position of the household, and when the estate manager, a quiet and precise man named Jeffrey, who had worked at the mansion for 11 years, came to ask if Daniel required anything, Daniel asked him a number of questions and listened to the answers fully before forming opinions. It was a different way of doing things than he was used to. He had always been, in his professional life, the person who came into a situation and rapidly assessed it and began reorganizing it toward greater efficiency. It was a skill. It had served him well. But he was learning that the mansion was not a situation requiring his reorganization. It was a home that had found its own organization, and his role in it was to contribute, not to restructure. This required a patience that did not come naturally to him. He worked on it anyway. He called his office in Edinburgh and formalized his extended return, negotiating a work arrangement that would allow him to be based at home for the foreseeable future. There were calls and complications and a degree of pushback from 2 of his colleagues that required careful handling. He managed it over the course of 3 days, working at the desk in his study, which remained the only room in the house that looked as it always had. He did not redecorate the study, but he left the door open. He had noticed, in the first week, that he had a habit of closing the study door entirely when he was in it, even when he had no need for the privacy. He had done it his whole adult life. It was a way of being unavailable, and he had never examined it as such. Now he noticed it, and he left the door open, and twice in 3 days Amara had paused in the doorway to tell him something small, which she might not have done if the door had been shut, and once his mother had walked past and he had been able to say good morning to her without either of them needing to make an occasion of it. Small things. He was learning that everything that mattered was a small thing done consistently. On Wednesday of that week, he drove Amara to her prenatal appointment. His mother came as well, sitting in the back seat with a paperback she did not open. At the clinic, they sat in the waiting room together, the 3 of them in a row, and Daniel was aware of what an unusual picture they made. He was also aware that he had not been to a single appointment before this one. There had been 7. He had missed all 7. Amara's doctor was a calm and precise woman named Dr. Brenda Fuller, who had been managing the pregnancy from the beginning, and clearly knew Amara well. She greeted Daniel with a professional pleasantness that did not draw attention to his absence from previous appointments, but he felt the absence anyway, as a fact of the room, the way you feel a gap in a row of things even when no one is pointing at it. He paid close attention during the entire appointment. He asked questions where he had them, and stayed quiet where he did not. On the way out, Amara took his hand in the corridor without looking at him, and he held it, and they walked to the car. In the car, his mother said from the back seat, "She said everything looks well." "She did," Amara said. "Good," said Margaret, and the word had in it a particular weight of something she did not name, but which was unmistakable to both of the people in the front seat. That evening, for the first time since he had returned, Daniel sat with both women in the sitting room after dinner. He had not forced this. He had simply come to the sitting room when dinner was done and found them both already there, Amara on the sofa with her feet up and a cup of tea, his mother in the armchair nearest the lamp with her book. They had looked up when he came in. He had sat down in the chair across from his mother and picked up a book he had not yet opened from the side table. They sat together and did nothing in particular for 2 hours. He did not know when he had last done nothing in particular in this house. Perhaps never. The mansion had always been a place of function and formality, of purpose and position. No one had ever simply sat in it before, as far as he knew. But here they were, sitting. Amara dozed slightly at one point and then resurfaced and picked up her tea. His mother turned her pages with the methodical pace of a woman who reads every word. Daniel's book was good, and he found himself reading without thinking about reading, which was a state he had not reached in months. At one point, without planning to, he said, "What is Carol like?" referring to his mother's friend from the prenatal group. His mother looked up from her book. She considered the question. "She is absolutely terrible at cards," she said. "She cheats, not to win, but out of habit. And she laughs at her own jokes before she finishes telling them, which ought to be irritating, but somehow is not." "She brought your mother flowers last week," Amara said, "from her own garden." "Yellow ones," his mother said, and returned to her book. Daniel thought about the yellow flowers in the clay pot in the entrance hall. He went back to his book, and the room was quiet, and the evening was ordinary, and Daniel Hargrove sat in his family home and felt, for the first time in longer than he could account for, that he was actually in it. He was in the kitchen when it happened. It was a Tuesday morning, 38 weeks into the pregnancy, and Daniel was making coffee, and Amara was standing at the counter eating a piece of toast when she went still. Not dramatically. She simply stopped moving and held the edge of the counter and breathed once, slowly and carefully. Daniel set down the coffee pot. "Amara." "It's fine," she said, and then, 3 seconds later, actually, he was already moving. His mother was in the house. She appeared in the kitchen doorway within a minute, because Margaret Hargrove had the particular alertness of a woman who has been waiting for something and hears it when it comes. She looked at Amara at the counter. She looked at Daniel. She did not ask a lot of questions. She said, "I'll get the bag," and disappeared up the stairs. Daniel stood with Amara at the counter while she worked through the contraction. He put his hand on her back and she did not ask him to move it, which he took as permission. She breathed the way the classes had taught her, which he knew from the pamphlet she had left on the bedside table, because he had read it twice. "It's early," she said. "2 weeks early," he said. "Dr. Fuller said 2 weeks was fine." "I know she did," Amara said. "I just want to say it." "Say it," he said. She breathed through another one. "It's 2 weeks early," she said. "2 weeks early and completely fine," he said. She almost smiled. His mother reappeared with the hospital bag, which had been packed for 3 weeks, and had been sitting by the bedroom door, and also, Daniel noticed, a small additional bag that he had not seen before, which turned out to contain things for Amara and things for Margaret herself, because his mother had packed herself a bag as well, without telling anyone, which was, he thought, the most Margaret Hargrove thing that had ever happened. They drove to the hospital. Daniel drove. Amara sat in the passenger seat, and his mother sat in the back exactly as she had on the appointment day, except this time she did not bring the paper back. At the hospital, things moved with a speed and a purpose that was both frightening and reassuring. The staff knew Amara. They had seen her through this whole pregnancy, and they called her by name and wheeled her through with a calm efficiency that Daniel found he was grateful for, in a way that was almost physical. He was grateful for every person in that building who knew what they were doing, because he was aware, walking beside Amara's chair with his hand on her shoulder, that he was not the person who had been present for all of this. He was not the person who had built the relationship with Dr. Fuller or the nurses. He was not the one who had made 7 appointments and prepared the bag and researched what was normal and what was not. He was the person who was here now. He was going to be here now as completely as he knew how. In the delivery room, he stayed where Amara needed him, and he did not speak when speaking was not useful, and he did not try to manage the room, because the room did not need his management. He held her hand when she wanted it held, and he stepped back when she wanted space, and he watched a woman he had not been present enough for demonstrate, in a room of controlled difficulty, the depth of a strength he had not adequately recognized. His mother waited outside. It was a long wait. He knew this because when he eventually came through the door into the corridor, Margaret Hargrove was standing against the wall with her hands folded and her face arranged, but her eyes gave her away entirely. She was 62 years old, and she had been waiting her whole life for something she did not have a name for until now. And when she looked at Daniel in the corridor doorway, and he nodded, her eyes filled with tears for the first time he had ever seen in his entire life. He had not known his mother could cry. He was beginning to understand, There was a great deal about his mother he had not known. He held the door open, and she went through it. The baby was a girl. She was small and entirely complete, and she had a faint amount of dark hair, and she was looking at the lights above her with the particular expression of a person encountering the world and finding it interesting. She was placed in Margaret's arms at Amara's direction, and Daniel watched his mother hold his daughter for the first time, and watched her face do something he had never seen it do, which was open entirely, without any of the architecture she had built around herself over 60 years. Just open, as if the baby had reached up with her small hand and taken a wall down from the inside. Margaret did not cry, not quite, but she held the baby the way a woman holds something she waited 4 decades to hold, and when she looked up and found Daniel watching her, she said nothing at all, which was the most eloquent thing she had ever communicated. He went and sat beside Amara. She was exhausted and quiet and more beautiful than he had words for. He took her hand. She let him. She turned her head to look at him, and he looked back at her, and neither of them needed to say anything about the past 8 months in that moment, because the past 8 months were finished, and everything in front of them was not. The baby's name took them 2 more days to agree on, not because they fought about it, because they considered it carefully, each of them, including Margaret, who had an opinion she had been asked for, and gave it thoughtfully, and accepted the final decision gracefully, when it went in a slightly different direction. The name was not anyone's family name. It was not a name that belonged to anyone who had come before. It was a new name, for a new person, who had arrived into a house that had become something better than it had been, and who had no obligation to be anything other than exactly what she was. Daniel Hargrove brought his wife and his daughter home to the mansion on a Thursday afternoon. The gate was open. It had been open every evening since he came back. He had stopped noticing it as a detail and started accepting it as a new fact of the house, which was something he was learning to do with many things. He carried his daughter through the front door of the mansion, where generations of Hargroves had entered and exited with their particular weights and histories and errors and occasional dignities. He carried her past the portrait of his father and past the clay pot with the yellow flowers. He carried her up the stairs past the row of small potted plants and the tiny green booties on the hook beside the nursery door. In the nursery, Margaret was already there, adjusting the mobile above the crib so that it turned freely, the small paper birds moving in a slow circle in the air from the open window. She stepped back when Daniel came in. She did not make a ceremony of it. She simply moved back to the armchair and sat down, and pulled the pale quilt over her lap, and looked at the crib with an expression that was quiet and full and finally at peace. Daniel settled the baby into the crib. She looked up at the moving birds. She did not fuss. She seemed, in the way of newborns who have not yet learned that the world is complicated, perfectly content. Amara came and stood beside him. She put her hand in his. They stood at the edge of the crib and watched their daughter watch the birds, and the room around them held 40 years of a locked grief that had been released, and a year and a half of a difficult adjustment that had become something real, and 8 months of an absence that had cost something true, and would not be forgotten, but would also not be the last word. The last word was in the room with them. It was small, and it had dark hair, and it was watching a mobile made of paper birds that 2 women had chosen together on a Saturday afternoon in the spring, in a room that had finally been opened. Daniel looked at the mobile. He looked at Amara beside him. He looked at his mother in the armchair, her hands still and her face quiet in a way he had never seen. He had come back to this house, expecting to restore what he had left. He had found something better. He had found a family that had already learned how to be one, and now he was learning to be part of it. Not at the center of it, not in charge of it, part of it. The baby made a small sound, not distress, something else, something like recognition of the room and the people in it, and the warmth and the softness, and the slow turning of birds above her head. Daniel stayed where he was. He did not move to fix anything, because nothing needed fixing. He stood beside his wife in the nursery of the house his mother had slowly, quietly, improbably allowed to become a home, and he was present, fully and without reservation, for the first time in a very long time. That was where he intended to remain.